Rudolf Steiner. Causes and intellectual background of the First World War. Summary of the Stuttgart lecture of September 30, 1914. What has been essentially long awaited has now seemingly broken into the world as a result of various recent events, as occult factors may have played a role in this. In this way, we have witnessed important events, the deeper meaning and significance of which we will not really fully understand until later. And much of what underlies these fateful events is still completely out of the question today. For many years we have tried to deepen our spiritual knowledge within ourselves, but now we are, in a sense, facing a real test. We need to take a test of our ability to cling to the great ideals of the spiritual world in spite of all the current difficulties. We are not a society that embraces homogeneous, united ethnic groups, but rather seeks to extend the spirit of reconciliation to the whole world. Related to this is that we are subject to a certain test, because it is in these very times that it is extremely difficult to judge things objectively, in reality and fairly. Recently, various voices have been heard from across the Rhine, German barbarism and the like have been spoken of, and the most hateful accusations and slander have been brought against us. Even the renowned representatives of the French intellectual life incited hatred and anger in the people. And in this case, personal things should also be considered as symptoms and characteristic symptoms. It is all the sadder that it was Maurice Maeterlinck who attacked the Germans and the German spirit in the fiercest and most hateful way. Although Maurice Maeterlinck would be nowhere without Noblesse. Great things are happening in our time, great things are happening. And only in the future will we be able to call on significant events of recent times to help us understand what is happening in our time, in the sense of repeating certain things. A lot of things have to add up for something to repeat, for significant historical events to recur, so to speak. Just as in the heyday of Greco-Latin culture, the Romans had to fight the Punic Wars against Carthage, just as the famous Battle of Mylae decided the fate of the Romans, k.r.e. 260, who have succeeded in defending the flourishing Greco-Roman culture against the flood of forces of the seemingly still strong Carthage Empire. We see a kind of recurrence of certain events at the beginning of the present war. We can say this here and now. There was a remarkable battle going on between the Romans and the Carthaginians at the time. With their strong fleet, the Carthaginians had a huge naval superiority over the Romans, who could only win a big victory with the unusual idea of connecting their ships with wide bridges, turning the naval battle into an almost land battle in which they were superior. Just as something unheard of at the time happened, few would think, but now something similar has happened and which has a certain connection with these events, and about which the coming ages will speak as a key event. I mention these things only because I would like to draw attention to the significance of what is happening today. I can talk about these things this way the way I am going to talk because in a sense my karma has prepared me for this. I was born in an empire that is said to have played a very important role in the war between peoples. But as an adult, I see homelessness as part of my class from an early age. My childhood dates back to a time when German hatred was felt even in Austria, when Austria was still under the influence of the Prussian victory, when even the Germans in Austria hated the Imperial Germans. I have no reason to be biased against Germany. It is this homelessness that entitles me, through my karma, to speak about these things objectively and in the spirit of anthroposophy. We have to make inappropriate prophecies. So today we leave unanswered the question of who will ultimately win, as this is highly doubtful. But a kind of victory was already achieved before the outbreak of the war, an important victory, which is related to our spiritual investigation, and which will have indelible traces forever. What kind of victory is this? Has Central Europe not been connected to the east of the continent for a long time? And we are not talking about the people of Eastern Europe here. You can learn a lot about this people from the lecture series entitled The Mission of Individual People's Spirits. We must distinguish between the people of Eastern Europe and the three good birds that are now at the head of this people in opposition to German spirituality, Tsarism, Russian militarism and false Pan-Slavism. There were certain threads that connected the heart of Europe, Germany and Austria, and Tsarist Russia. However, with the war message of 31st of July, 1914, this thread was swept aside between the German and Austrian leadership and the Tsarist court. It was a great victory. Presumably, from the Western powers. There are important features of world history in this, and the events taking place between Central Europe, the Western powers and Russia at the time must certainly reflect on us. If we want to be fair and judge things right on the ground of anthroposophy, we cannot turn a blind eye to the unnatural alliance between Western and Northwestern Europe, France and England, and Eastern Europe, Russia. When we were arguing with Annie Besant, the president of the Theosophical Society, it was the Indian scholar who said that the way Mrs. Besant demanded tolerance at the time was like a man being cut off his hand, and he protests against it. We would shout, "Be tolerant, be peaceful, otherwise you will stir up strife." Not much will be realized if we don't realize it's a complete inability to expect the other to let go of his hand without protesting. In recent weeks, the same thing has often been heard, that Austria would have been tolerant of peace if it had not started a war with Serbia. It's the same. It is as if we are shouting at someone whose hand is being cut off, "Be patient." Nowadays, there are many opportunities for us to gain objectivity through the painful events that take place around us. To do this, however, we must learn to think correctly. This is also the task of anthroposophy. There is that particular cycle of lectures on folk spirits, mission of individual folk spirits. If, in these disastrous times, we are unable to take what is said there completely seriously, our explanations at the time may seem like mere theoretical play. Only if they completely permeate all our cartilage, our body and soul, will we be able to understand what is happening now. In the penultimate lecture of the folk spirits cycle, I tried to show how the individual spirits relate to each other, like the different forces of the soul, as the three parts of the human soul, and their interplay. I have drawn their attention to the fact that, if we take the peoples of Italy and Spain, they represent the aftermath of the third, cultural, era after Atlantis. The character of these peoples expresses the sentient soul. In the case of France it is the intellectual soul, in England it is the soul of consciousness, and in the middle of Europe it is the self. As anthroposophists, we know that the German spirit is the essence of Europe. It's an objective, occult fact. We also know that there may be struggles in the soul of man, that certain parts of the soul may be at war with one another. And so in the days of peace, in the course of our quiet spiritual work in this cycle of lectures, we have laid the foundations for something, so to speak, that is flooding the world today. For the most part, what is happening now will only be understandable to us if we take into account everything we have said in the aforementioned cycle of people's spirits. Only then will we gain the necessary objectivity. It happens in every war that one party blames the other and shifts responsibility to it. But it is not appropriate for us, my dear friends, to think so. A different way of thinking is worthy of us. I would like to shed some light on this. Suppose someone gets older and imagine a child snapping out of him with fresh force. What would be the point if the old man resented the child and said to him, "You, my child, with your youthful strength, it is your fault that I bear the burdens and weaknesses of old age." It also makes little sense to accuse the Germans now that they are responsible for the war. We need to be aware that the cause of what is happening lies in the karma of the peoples. The lives of peoples are also young and old. And just as the fresh forces of a child in a person's life are not responsible for the fact that in his old age man no longer has that freshness, it is just as foolish to make such accusations about the lives of peoples. We must not be blinded by all the rumors that are being made about this. We have to take into account the facts, the objective reality. The deeper causes and contexts of what is happening today are still pulling us out of our investigation today, not to mention that such an investigation would evoke bad feelings in some today. However, I would like to draw your attention to a few things. There have also been surprises for the occultist recently. And I can say that after my series of lectures in Norrköping, Sweden, in July 1914, I had the opportunity or the duty to say a few words about one of these surprises. It is true that the fact that these events had to happen has been foreseeable for years, as has the fact that, due to fate, they had to happen this year. The Sarajevo assassination took place not long ago, with very specific consequences that the occultist may have observed. I have often emphasized how different things are here on the physical plane than in the spiritual world, that many times the opposite is manifested. To my great surprise, this was also the case when I was able to compare the individuality of the assassinated, heir to the throne, before and after his death. Something quite strange happened to him. This personality became a kind of cosmic force. I mention this to draw attention to the fact that things on the physical plane are all manifestations of the spirit, and that the events of the physical world can only be truly understood if we see through them and see their spiritual background. Some of you are already familiar with my earlier statement. Horror hovered there in the astral world. You just could not descend to the physical plane, because on the physical plane there were astral forces, forces of fear, which, acting as a kind of counteraction, prevented it from happening. It was July 20th, 1914, when I knew that these fear-makers had now become the forces of courage, of boldness. It is an indescribably great fact, the forces of fear have become the forces of boldness. This explains the unique phenomenon that took place on the physical plane, war, enthusiasm. This fact was shocking to me as well, and as far as I know, no occultist has known about it so far. You have all witnessed how this enthusiasm has captivated people over the course of a few days, even those who used to be completely peace-loving, flooding them like a wave of boldness. And not long after, we were sad to hear the horrific sacrifices this war was making. When I was in Berlin in the early days of September, 1914, a deep pain flooded my soul when I saw that the color flower of the Germans had to fall victim to the battlefield. I surrendered to this pain, and it resulted in occult research, which is not to my credit. In the midst of pain, the soul receives occult cognition. It was infinitely significant to me when I noticed the close connection beyond the death of the souls who are now directly involved in the great events. For it was often seen that those who found their deaths by an enemy bullet, and not in the waking state, but entered the spirit worlds, remained in touch with what was happening here. I don't know if they can imagine what it meant to me when I saw before my spiritual eyes that the souls of their fallen comrades had a protective effect on soldiers fighting on the battlefield. This is one of my most unique, incomprehensible occult experiences. Soldiers killed in battle remain connected to the events taking place here, and stand as a second personality behind those who go into battle here on the physical plane. That is, not only the living fight, but the dead stay in touch with the fate of the living. There are also things in the spiritual worlds that can fill our hearts and souls with confidence, even if that confidence is not so easy. So, with our spiritual gaze, it was possible to see how those who fell on the battlefield, after their deaths helped those on the battlefield who had to go after them to battle. The clairvoyant consciousness sees this. It is the result of spiritual research. If dead souls help the living, it can be comfort to us in the midst of pain. Here, too, spiritual cognition can give us comfort, and we can even draw strength from this cognition in these difficult times. From the study of the spiritual sciences, we know that the path of human development is directed and guided by spiritual beings. In the spiritual world, it is prescribed that this or that thing must happen by about a certain time. Suppose it is prescribed to earthly humanity that by 1950 or 1970 it must reach a certain level of the ability of love to overcome egoism. Spiritual science actually wants to develop this ability of love. And it does so in a similar way to how wood produces heat in the stove. And the ability to love can be born through the Word. In our spiritual current, we strive to develop the capacity for love through the great teachings of anthroposophy. But if people do not listen to the good word, if they do not obey this word enough, if things happen too slowly, so that the capacity for love and self-sacrifice does not develop enough by the prescribed time, then another teacher must be on the scene. To step in, to war as a great teacher. Great events are taking place in our time. They can only be approached by the great events of the past, which build on each other cyclically. As the Romans fought against the punks, as important and decisive were the struggles of the age of migration for the future and culture of the peoples, just as significant is the struggle in which we are right in the middle. If we look back to recent times, researching some of the main causes of the war, we have to look back to the time of the Punic Wars in the 3rd century BC, when the Roman commander was able to reap his first great victory by using bridges. They can look it up in history books. And even now something similar happened as the first major event of the war. It's not easy to get into these things today, but future historiography will justify them. Everything else takes us back to a time when the Romans fought the Germans, which decided the fate of people and peoples for millennia. And then comes the third major event, the present one, which will really be as important as the Punic Wars once, which, of course, were much smaller in scale than today's global events, but because of their quality and significance, they still have a great impact on our time. Just as the great events of migration associated with the migration of people and peoples are repeated in some way, and as was once decisive in Rome, the pre-Christ form of the human self had to be transformed into a later, post-Christ form. Just as the new form of the self then had to find its way through the Romans, so today, in the next stage of human development, the new form of the self must once again find its way in the midst of the war between peoples. Those who are now on the battlefields and shedding their blood on the battlefield are sacrificing for something that needs to happen. It must happen to the salvation of mankind. And if we look at these sacrifices, their great pain, one thing, if it does not cheer us up, can fill us with great inner reassurance: holy blood is flowing here, the blood sanctified by the great events, and those who are now shedding their blood, they will be the main custodians of the future. Much will become clear to us if we are able to regard this bloodshed as a sacred blood sacrifice. Dear friends, the purpose of my presentation today was to compare what we learned during our spiritual studies with what is happening now so that we can stand the test of our ability to judge current events and conditions correctly. For spirituality will also come through the great master who is now marching through Europe. But man was born free. Much depends on those who unite with us in the spiritual movement. If the ideals of anthroposophy are properly present in your soul today, in the days of probation, the space that is now filled with a flood of confused tempers and passions will be filled with pure radiant spiritual thoughts and true sacred feelings. Our feelings now will be salutary if they are connected with the awareness that a victory is possible, the triumph of the Spirit. We can have confidence that the Spirit will prevail. He who connects himself with the Spirit will find the right path to wisdom, for wisdom can only come from connection with the Spirit. Just the week before the war broke out, I read the following sentences in the newspaper: despite Mr. Liebknecht's objections, I do not think we need to tell the truth in politics. We don't have to cling to the truth unless it turns out or we harm ourselves. This statement is a faithful imprint of the materialism of our time, which we would drown in materialism without this war, and it is the task of our movement to overcome and transcend this materialism. In sharp contrast to the inaudible statement quoted above, the motto of our spirit science movement is, Only truth can be the source of wisdom. Shortly before the outbreak of the war, I read the lines described by a reputable journalist. Despite Mr. Liebknecht's objections, I am convinced that a responsible leader has not only the right but also the duty to deny the truth and to make untruths. That right or duty of public morals is limited by only two circumstances: the untruth must not be provable and must not be in the public interest. If we compare this statement with what we chose as the slogan when we founded the Anthroposophical Society, "Only truth can be the source of wisdom," a lot becomes understandable, as it moves completely different feelings into the souls of those who feel the seriousness of the current situation. It shows here how much we need the spirit of truth if we really want to understand things ourselves, if we want to know them according to reality. After all, it is a matter of getting to the objectivity that can only be obtained through the spirit of truth. And then we can recognize today what will be recognized in later times, that this war is in fact a conspiracy against German intellectual life. It is not yet easy for present-day humanity, especially today, to see with sufficient objectivity and impartiality all that we have often pointed out in the context of the spiritual sciences, and which is also included in the lectures on folk spirits. Those who want to deal with spiritual life in accordance with the true spirit of our time must understand that the people's spirits, the true souls of the people, form a kind of choir in which they already live in complete harmony. But man must find a way to their being, and this is only possible in a spiritual way. I would like to draw your attention to how we can find our way to the spirit of the people, how we can have an intimate dialogue, a confidential, internal dialogue with the spirit of the people to which we belong. I can only advise you to use Du, Meinzer den Raumsgeist. If you have a few minutes, especially now. You, the spirit of my earth, to speak out for the people's spirit to be able to navigate the current world situation. Through this we find a way to the people's spirit to whom we belong, and from this people we find a way to the dialogue between the people's spirit and Christ, who is the teacher of all people's spirits. For the spirits of the people shall find one another in Christ, for all the spirits of the people that lead their people in the right way regard Christ as their master. And he leads the nations by the spirits of the people in such a way that it serves not only the good and salvation of the people, but of all mankind. By spruch on the people's spirit, we look at our own people's spirit as we speak to Christ himself. We speak to Christ through our folk spirit, which also serves the cause of the people and of humanity. And this can fill our hearts with hope of peace even in times of great war. End of reading.